Hello, anatomy colleagues. Welcome back. So in our last video, we discussed the neurocranium. So now we're going to finish off the rest of the bones of the skull, discussing the viscerocranium. So similar to what we had here, we're going to discuss the individual bones, and then we're going to talk about specific bony landmarks. And anytime I talk about a bony landmark, I talk about why I want you to know it as well. Is something attached there? Does it form something? Does neurovasculature travel through that region? So make sure you understand those. Okay. So when we talk about the viscerocranium, we're talking about the facial skeleton for the most part. So things that are associated, obviously, with the face, most of the orbit, nasal cavity, oral cavity, that type of structure. And importantly here, it's also going to include the mandible. So less important in terms of protecting the brain, even though certainly there will be associations with the brain, but more in terms of forming the face. So when we're looking at an anterior view of the skull, some of the things that really are most obvious are obviously the orbits. You're going to have the nasal cavity. So this is kind of leading into the nasal cavity here, and then into the oral cavity behind the teeth here. One of the things that you will notice when you're looking into the nasal cavity here is kind of right down the midline, you're going to have what's referred to as a nasal septum. And it literally is, if everything is right or going to be right down the midline, you can have deviation there, obviously, and that's going to be a deviated septum. And then on either side, you will have the nasal cavity. So over here would be the left nasal cavity and then the right nasal cavity. And the nasal septum is going to be composed of two bones and cartilage. And so generally the most prominent thing, particularly when we're talking anteriorly, will be the cartilage. And this generally is what's going to be deviated. If it's bony deviation, oftentimes that involves the vomer, which is going to be the more inferior bone. So you can see that here highlighted in blue. And then the more superior bone is going to be a portion of the ethmoid, specifically the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. So remember we talked about the ethmoid with all those cribriform foramina up here? Well, it's also going to have this fairly plate-like portion that's going to form a big part of the nasal septum. And you can see that here in green. Now on either side, so part of the nasal cavity proper, you're going to have what's referred to as nasal concha. Sometimes you hear them referred to as nasal turbinates. And these are going to be extremely thin bone that are going to be lined with mucous membrane, and they are going to also be highly vascularized. So it really increases the surface area within the nasal cavity to allow for things to not go into or past the nasal cavity. So things like pathogens or that type of stuff. But also importantly, it really plays a role in terms of warming and moisturizing, as well as humidifying any inhaled air. So it kind of allows for air to kind of go through this kind of turbulent period before it heads back to become part of the rest of the respiratory system. The superior and middle nasal concha, which you can see here and here on this illustration, are actually of the ethmoid bone. So they are components of the ethmoid bone. So you'll have a superior and a middle nasal concha on either side. And then the larger inferior nasal concha is its own bone. And you can see generally when you're looking into a skull and you're looking into the nasal cavity, really the major one you can see is the inferior nasal concha. The nasal bones, unlike those nasal concha, which you can see really well here in the nasal septum, are fairly nondescript. Really, there's two of them. So here's one, and they're not doing too much. They're forming kind of the roof over this area. If you think about where your glasses would sit, they're sitting right there on those nasal bones there. So there are two nasal bones. So unlike the nasal bone, which were fairly nondescript, the maxillary bones, or the maxillae, or the maxilla, if you're talking about one, are very complex and extremely important in terms of the viscerocranium. This is going to be the upper jaw portion. And importantly, this is where these maxillary bones are going to house the maxillary teeth, or your upper teeth. Also, if you're looking at an inferior view, you see it's going to play a pretty big role in terms of the hard palate, which we'll talk about in a moment. But really what I want to focus on here is that you're having these upper maxillary bone or teeth that are associated here. Now, focusing in on the hard palate, you're going to have a soft palate, which extends past here. And we'll talk about that a bit more when we get into muscles. But when we're talking about the hard palate, so if you put your tongue up against the top of your mouth, you're feeling your hard palate, obviously lined with membrane as well. So this is going to have the maxillary bones serving the biggest role here, taking up the most surface area. And then the palatine bones are going to be more posteriorly projecting in terms of the hard palate. So palatine bones, you would think they play a bigger role in the hard palate, but it's really these maxillary bones that are playing the biggest role. And if you've ever heard of a cleft palate, this can be a failure of the two sides to unite, both in terms of the soft palate as well as the hard palate. And this generally is due to a failure to unite during embryonic development. And you can have a cleft palate with a cleft lip, but not necessarily so. So generally a cleft lip is actually more common than a cleft palate. Okay, we talked a little bit about the zygomatic bones when we were talking about the neurocranium because of the zygomatic process. A lot of times colloquially, you'll hear the zygomatic bones referred to as your cheekbones. A more traditional term for the zygomatic bone are the malar bones, if you've ever heard of that. It's the same thing as the zygomatic bones and really easily palpable here. In another area with a lateral blow to the head, that could affect your zygomatic bones, but oftentimes it'll more often affect the zygomatic process here. Some of the smaller bones associated with the viscerocranium are the lacrimal bones. So you can see it really nicely outlined here. There's one on either side. So your lacrimal gland, which is your gland that produces tears, actually is housed right up here with the frontal bone. Eventually, tears will kind of make its way over down to the lacrimal bone, and there's this fossa here that allows for it to drain into the nasal cavity. So if you've ever had a really hard cry and you feel it like in your nasal cavity, it's because those tears will drain in there. Generally, you don't have enough tears for it to drain. It's generally with, a crying episode where you'll have that occur. And you can see when you're looking at dry bone that the lacrimal gland is so thin that generally it often will break post-mortem. Now, many of these bones associated with the viscerocranium will have paranasal sinuses associated with them, and even some of the bones of the neurocranium. And these are going to basically be hollow areas within some of these bones. And they're hollow areas, but importantly, they're mucous membrane lined. All right, so they're mucous membrane lined. They can become inflamed, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but they also play a role in terms of lightening the skull overall because you have these hollow portions. If you had a completely full of maxillary bones that are completely filled with bone, that would be much heavier than what we actually have. And these will all drain into the lateral nasal walls. So all these sinuses will drain into the lateral nasal walls. So closely associated with those nasal concha. And they're going to be located in 4 major bones. Now, we talked about the mastoid air cells. They're similar to paranasal sinuses, but not quite the same. It's really these 4 bones that are going to play the biggest role. And the largest one are going to be the maxillary sinuses. With the frontal sinuses also can be quite large. Oftentimes you'll see it divided into 2 sinuses, but sometimes it can kind of meld into one. There are going to be sphenoid sinuses. And sometimes it's just the one. And then generally you have a lot of individual kind of air cells associated with the ethmoid bone. But these are the 4 bones where you'll have paranasal sinuses. And if you've ever heard of sinusitis or a sinus infection, this will involve these paranasal sinuses. It will be the inflammation of the mucous membrane that's lining a paranasal sinus. So it's either only one of your paranasal sinuses, or if it's quite severe, it could affect more than one. And you can think about it. If you inflame those sinuses, that can really make that area smaller in those regions. Generally, you'll have it kind of drain into those lateral nasal cavities, but sometimes that drainage isn't sufficient, and you get that really kind of stopped up feeling that can cause pain. Anytime you have inflammation, that can oftentimes lead to pain. All right, this favorite view that we've looked at with the cranial base, we're looking into the cranial base. I know this isn't necessarily part of the viscerocranium, but I have a little time to talk about this here. So during life, obviously, the brain is going to sit here. And the brain is going to be shaped in a way where you're going to have different lobes associated with these areas. And this creates this really distinct pattern that you will see in this view of cranial fossae. So just overall cranial fossae. You're going to have an anterior cranial fossa, a middle cranial fossa. So to start, the anterior cranial fossa is a bit more shallow. And it's almost like you're stepping downstairs. It gets a little bit deeper with this middle cranial fossa. And then by far the deepest of the fossae are the posterior cranial fossa. And it's deep because not only do you have, say, the occipital lobes of the cerebrum sitting here, but you also have the cerebellum and the brainstem kind of in this region. So this is by far the deepest of the cranial fossa. And we often discuss these and kind of compartmentalize these to help us get a handle on a lot of the foramina in these regions. So you have relatively less foramina in the anterior cranial fossa. You're certainly getting more in the middle, and then quite a few in the posterior. All right. Can't move on without talking about the mandible. So whereas the maxillary bones are going to be associated with the upper jaw, the mandible is going to be associated with the lower jaw. And sometimes when you hear somebody just refer to the jaw, they're talking about the mandible. And this is the only movable bone of the skull, other than which small bones in that temporal bone. Those bones within bone, those ear ossicles, those are movable as well. They're going to connect via joints. But really, when we think about the major one with really forceful movements, it's going to be the mandible. And obviously, similar to how we had those maxillary teeth associated with the maxilla, you're going to have mandibular teeth associated with the mandible. There are a few structures I want you to know on the mandible. This whole area right here is called the ramus of the mandible. It just means the more vertical part of the bone. Let's differentiate from the body here. And there's two things on the ramus I want you to be able to identify. The first is this nice smooth area right here referred to as the mandibular condyle. And it is this mandibular condyle, which is the M in the temporomandibular, the TMJ. So this is the mandibular portion of the temporomandibular joint. So it's going to articulate with that mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. And so this is going to be more posteriorly located, whereas the coronoid process is going to be more anteriorly located and more towards the teeth. So this is the coronoid process. And this is going to be the inferior attachment to one of your most powerful muscles of mastication or chewing, which is your temporalis muscle. So more to come here, but it's going to have this distal attachment here. One other very important structure associated with the mandible is what's referred to as the mandibular foramen. Anytime you have a foramen, you probably have some type of neurovasculature traversing it, and that is certainly true here. So we're looking at kind of the inside of the mandible here. It's been cut in half, and right here is the mandibular foramen. And through here, you're going to have a nerve travel. Well, you can have nerve and arteries, but really it's the nerve that's most important, which is your inferior alveolar nerve. And it is at this foramen, so you'll be able to kind of palpate this region right here called the lingula, that you would enter in anesthetic in order to perform an IAN, or inferior alveolar nerve block. And what that does is it essentially will knock out the sensation from one half of your mandibular teeth. So you'll have an IAN on one side and on the other side. And so if you block the IAN on the right side, it would knock out all these right-sided mandibular teeth. If you needed to knock them all out, you would have to do the same thing on the other side. Speaking of teeth, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because you are going to talk about this in the gastrointestinal portion of the course. But you do have 4 types of teeth. The incisors are these kind of thin cutting edges. The canine, you'll have one on each quadrant, both maxillary and mandibular. You'll have two associated with the incisors. These are kind of the puncturing teeth. Humans have relatively puny canines in comparison to some other animals. You're going to have premolars or bicuspids. These have two cusps, as the bicuspid would indicate. And then you're going to have molars, which are your most posterior teeth. These generally have 3 or more cusps associated with them. In all, most individuals will have 32 permanent teeth in all, so both maxillary and mandibular all together. Individuals that don't have third molars will have less, and then certainly you can lose teeth throughout your life due to extraction or just loss over time. Oftentimes you'll see this formula, which is indicative of how many types of teeth you have per quadrant, so 1/4 of your teeth. So the 2 indicates that you have 2 incisors. So say this is the dividing up. This is the going to be the maxillary region. This is the mandibular. So you'll have 2 incisors in each of a quadrant. So you'll have 2 here, and you'll also have 2 associated with the mandible, so on either side. So remember, these are quadrants, not the entirety of the maxillary teeth. You'll have 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars per quadrant. And this is in the permanent or adult dentition. You'll talk more about deciduous or baby teeth in the GI portion. But I just wanted to introduce this formula here. It's been helpful for me to be able to kind of remember that. All right, so let's finish up with a reminder in terms of the hard palate. I think the hard palate's an important area. We'll talk about soft palate more when we get to muscle. But when we talk about the hard palate, what makes up the majority of the hard palate in terms of bones? So pause the video, and if that doesn't pop up automatically, and kind of go find the answer. And when you're ready, I hope that you landed on C, the maxillae or maxillary bones. These are the maxillary bones are going to form the majority of the hard palate. It is not the very similarly named palatine bones, even though it is these palatine bones do form a part of the hard palate. So it's the maxilla and the palatine bones that form the hard palate, but it's the maxillary bones that form the majority or the more anterior portion. The mandible, no, that's lower jaw. Ethmoid, no, but the ethmoid and the vomer do form the nasal septum, but not the hard palate as the question indicated. All right, thanks so much for your time and attention here. We're going to move on to joints associated with the head in the next video. I'll see you there.